If you ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you are going to start your own podcast, or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you're going to need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. And if you ever want to read a book I have mentioned on this podcast, I now have an affiliated link for Bookshop. All the affiliated links that I mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. I just wanted to remind you that this podcast has merch, and this podcast is also on Patreon, and there's some perks that come along with joining the Patreon. I will leave the links to both of those things in the show notes. June 28th, 1914. That was the day that Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated. That caused Austria-Hungary to declare war on Serbia exactly 1 month later. The war spread before too long, and soon pretty much all of Europe was on fire. The fire spread across continents and oceans. Many would join the war, feeling that it was their patriotic duty to serve. After joining the war, some felt that it was their duty to report the carnage of war. So they put their pen to paper and they told the story of war with their poetry and their prose. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 23rd episode of the 4th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. We are in Season 4 of History Shelf, and it is titled, They Are a Rainbow. This season of History Shelf, I will be covering each week a historical figure that was part of the LGBTQIA community. These were people that, during their time, they had to hide a part of their identity from the world. So while I fully believe that those who were out and proud in their lifetime, even if it had the potential to cost them everything, deserve to be praised and recognized, those are not the people that I will be covering this season. I am covering the ones that were made to love in the shadows, the ones that had to lie to most or all of the people around them. Now, I know that sexual orientation and gender identity are complex, and some of the terms that I will use to describe these subjects were not around in some of their lifetimes. So some of these subjects obviously would not have used the same words to describe themselves as I will be using. But I don't want to get too hung up on my wording. I just want to celebrate a part of these individuals that in their time there was pressure all around them to feel shame about. I want to focus on that love and gender are not black and white. They are a rainbow. And for this week, I'm talking about Siegfried Sassoon. Siegfried was born Siegfried Lorraine Sassoon on September 8, 1886 in Matfield, Kent, England. Siegfried's mother was Teresa Thornycroft, and his father was Alfred Sassoon. His mother was an Anglo-Catholic. She came from a family of sculptors. Her family sculpted many of the best-known statues in London. Siegfried's father was Jewish. He was from India. He was from a wealthy Baghdadi Jewish family. Alfred's grandparents came from Iraq. Even though Alfred came from money, he was disinherited because he married someone outside of the Jewish faith. There is no German ancestry on either side of Siegfried's family, but Teresa gave her son a German name because she loved the German composer Richard Wagner. Siegfried's middle name was the surname of a clergyman that Teresa respected. Siegfried was not an only child. He had two brothers. He was the middle child. Siegfried had an older brother named Michael, and his younger brother was Hamo. Siegfried's parents didn't stay together for forever. His parents separated when he was 4 years old. His father would visit him and his brothers weekly, though. When his father would come over, Siegfried's mother would lock herself in her drawing room. This continued until 1895. 1895 was the year that Alfred died of tuberculosis. Siegfried went to New Beacon School in Sevenoaks, Kent, and Maryborough College in Wiltshire, and Clare College in Cambridge. At college, Siegfried studied history, but he never finished his degree. When he left college, it was 1907. Siegfried just floated along for a little bit. He spent his time hunting, playing cricket, and writing poetry. Some of the poetry he had published privately. His first volume of poetry was privately published in 1906. Even though his father, Alfred, had been disinherited, Siegfried had a small private income, so that was how he could live without a job. His first published success was The Daffodil Murderer, published in 1913. This was a parody of John Masefields' The Everlasting Mercy, and that was a poem about a man that turns away from sin and towards Christianity. One of the people that Siegfried was hanging out with during this time was Arthur Conan Doyle, the writer of Sherlock Holmes. They would sometimes play cricket together. Siegfried was a big lover of cricket. From the years 1914 to 1918, Europe was engaged in what was called the Great War. We now call that war World War I. Nationalism spread like wildfire, and many saw it as their patriotic duty to join the war. Siegfried enlisted. He enlisted with the Sussex Yeomanry on August 4th, 1914. That was the day that the United Kingdom declared war on Germany. Siegfried broke his arm in a riding accident, so he could not see active duty right away. He spent the spring of 1915 convalescing, but that could not last for forever. On May 29, 1915, he was commissioned into the 3rd Battalion Royal Welsh Fusiliers as a second lieutenant. Siegfried wasn't the only Sassoon brother that went to war. His younger brother Hamo joined the war, and on November 1st, 1950, Hamo was killed in the Gallipoli campaign. A grieving Siegfried was sent to France also in November of 1915. In France, Siegfried met Robert Graves. He was also a poet. Siegfried and Robert became friends. They would read and talk about each other's work. It did not take Siegfried long to be horrified by the horrors of war. The sweetness that his poetry held before the war was replaced with the wreckage of war. Rotting corpses, mangled limbs, filth, cowardice, and suicide now filled his poetry. This had an impact on the movement towards modernist poetry. Siegfried was disgusted with war, but that didn't mean he wasn't brave. There was even a time when he went in front of continuous gunfire to rescue a wounded soldier. This earned him the Military Cross. What he did was brave, but bravery may have not been the only reason he saved that fellow soldier. Siegfried had fallen into a deep depression. His bravery and recklessness earned him the nickname Mad Jack. As you can imagine, as the war raged on, Siegfried's depression deepened, and his writing continued to reflect that. Before the war, Siegfried was in a romantic relationship with David Cuthbert Thomas. On March 18, 1916, David was shot during the war. He was shot in the throat and he choked on his own blood and died. David was just 20 years old. The sadness that Siegfried felt about David's passing can be found in Siegfried's poetry. This comes from his poem, A Letter Home. Quote, "You and I have walked together in the starving winter weather. We've been glad because we knew time's too short and friends are few. We've been sad because we missed one whose yellow head was kissed by the gods who thought about him till they couldn't do without him. Now he's here again. I've been Soldier David dressed in green, standing in a wood that swings. To the magical he sings. He's come back, all mirth and glory, like the prince in a fairy story. Winter called him far away. Blossoms bring him home with May." End quote. Siegfried continued to be brave in war. He single-handedly captured a German trench. Armed with grenades, he scattered 60 German soldiers. Siegfried went over to the trench in daylight with rifles firing away at him. Siegfried scared away the soldiers in the trench. After scaring off the soldiers, Siegfried did not signal for reinforcements. Instead, he just sat down in the trench and he began reading a book of poems. He didn't even report when he made it back. Siegfried's colonel was furious at him because Siegfried decided to chill in a trench on his own. It delayed the attack on Mammoth's Wood for 2 hours because it was reported that British patrols were still out, but Siegfried was the British patrols. His colonel said, quote, "I'd have got you a DSO if you'd only shown more sense." End quote. DSO stands for Distinguished Service Order. Siegfried often went out on night raids and bombing patrols. Robert Graves described Siegfried as engaging in suicidal feats of bravery. In addition to the military cross that Siegfried was awarded on July 27, 1916, he was also awarded the Victoria Cross. In August of 1916, Siegfried became sick with gastric fever. Because of this, he was sent back to England. He was sent to Somerville College in Oxford to recover. It was there at Somerville College that Siegfried decided that he didn't want to return to war. He had some pacifist friends that encouraged this. One of those pacifist friends was someone that has shown up on this podcast before, but I have not done an episode on her. And that is Lady Atoline Morell. Remember, she showed up in the Virginia Woolf episodes that I did just this season. And remember, Virginia was also depressed by what the war had done. Siegfried sent a letter to his commanding officer. The letter was titled, "Finished with the War, a Soldier's Declaration." This is what the letter that is dated July of 1917 said, quote, "I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority because I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it. I am a soldier convinced that I am acting on behalf of soldiers. I believe that the war upon which I entered as a war of defense and liberation has now become a war of aggression and conquest. I believe that the purposes for which I and my fellow soldiers entered upon this war should have been so clearly stated as to have made it impossible to change them, and that had this been done, the objects which actuated us would now be obtainable by negotiation. I have seen and endured the sufferings of the troops, and I can no longer be a party to prolong these sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust. I am not protesting against the conduct of the war, but against the political errors and insincerities for which the fighting men are being sacrificed. On behalf of those who are suffering now, I make this protest against the deception which is being practiced upon them. Also, I believe it may help to destroy the callous complacency with which the majority of those at home regard the continuance of agonies which they do not share and which they have not enough imagination to realize. End quote. This letter was forwarded to the press on July 31st, 1917, and it was also read aloud in the House of Commons a day before by a member of Parliament that was sympathetic. But not everyone was sympathetic. In fact, some saw this letter as treasonous. An act such as this was not something that the military took lightly. This was something that could be a court martial, and many thought that that was what was going to happen. It probably would have happened, but Siegfried's friend Robert Graves stepped in. Robert made a case that Siegfried was suffering with shell shock. That is what PTSD used to be called. We don't know if Siegfried was actually suffering from PTSD, but Robert was able to get Siegfried out of a court martial. Undersecretary of State for War Ian McPherson decided that Siegfried should not go back to war, and instead he should go to Craiglockhart War Hospital. That hospital is in Scotland, near Edinburgh. There at the hospital, Siegfried met a fellow soldier named Wilfred Owen. Not only was Wilfred a fellow soldier, but he was also a fellow poet. The two grew close. Soon they were exchanging love letters back and forth. One of Siegfried and Wilfred's love letters was quoted in the book Red, White, and Royal Blue. That is the book/movie that inspired this whole season. They are actually the last couple this season that is mentioned in that book, and I am so glad that they were. Their story is really beautiful, and I probably wouldn't have never known about it had they not been mentioned in that book. This is a quote from one of Wilfred's letters to Siegfried, dated November 5th, 1917. Quote, "Know that since mid-September, when you still regarded me as a tiresome little knocker on your door, I held you as Keats and Christ and Elijah and my colonel and my fellow confessor and Amenophis the fourth in profile. What's that mathematically? In effect, it is this, that I love you dispassionately, so much, so very much, dear fellow, that the blasting little smile you wear reading this can't hurt me in the least. If you consider what the above names have severely done for me, you will know what you are doing, and you have fixed my life, however short. You did not like me. I was always a mad comet, but you have fixed me. I spun around you a satellite for a month, but I shall swing out soon, a dark star in the orbit where you will blaze." End quote. I wish I could tell you that their story has a happy ending, but I cannot. Wilfred was killed in war. He was shot at the Saint-Merlos Canal on November 4th, 1918. He was just 25 years old. The war ended 1 week later. Wilfred's poems were published in 1920. Siegfried and Edith Sitwell edited them. Only a few of Wilfred's letters to Siegfried have survived. Siegfried destroyed many of his letters. Perhaps it was just too hard to hold on to them. Or maybe that was a request of Wilfred's. Wilfred did tell his mother to burn a sackful of his papers, and Wilfred's brother Harold for many years prevented research into Wilfred's private life. My guess is to prevent people from finding out that Wilfred was gay. Years after Wilfrid's death, Siegfried wrote, quote, "W's death was an unhealed wound, and the ache of it has been with me ever since. I wanted him back, not his poems." End quote. At the end of 1917, Siegfried had been posted to Limerick, Ireland. There he trained new recruits. He loved his time in Limerick. When he was there, he had time to hunt, and that was a favorite hobby of his. He didn't stay there long before he was posted to Egypt. Siegfried was promoted to lieutenant. He spent some time in Palestine, and on July 13th, 1918, he returned to France. He was promoted to acting captain. In France, Siegfried was wounded in the head by friendly fire. A British soldier thought that Siegfried was a German soldier. There was an online tabloid that suggested that the fire was not all that friendly. The tabloid that published the article back in 2018 suggested that the British soldier actually meant to shoot Siegfried, though the credibility of this claim is questionable. Because Siegfried was injured, whether it be by accident or on purpose, Siegfried was sent back to Britain for the remainder of the war. On March 12, 1919, he relinquished his commission on health grounds, but he kept his rank of captain. Wilfrid was not the only love in Siegfried's life. He actually had a handful of lovers before he passed. One was named William Park Atkin. He went by the name Gabriel. Gabriel was a landscape architectural and figure painter. Gabriel was also a soldier in the war. They got connected through another soldier named Edward Dent. Edward and Gabriel became friends in March of 1917. Gabriel was eager to meet Siegfried. He was a fan of Siegfried's poetry. Edward let Siegfried know in November of 1917 that Gabriel wanted to meet him, but Siegfried sort of just dismissed it. He basically told Edward that Gabriel sounded like an alright dude, and it was a shame that they were not nearer to each other. In October of 1918, Siegfried and Gabriel were supposed to meet each other, but Siegfried wrote to him postponing their meeting. In November of 1918, Siegfried was staying with Augustus Theodore Bartholomew. He went by Theo. Theo was a librarian at Cambridge University Library. He was also a friend of Siegfried's, and he also found himself in Gabriel's bed on more than one occasion. Theo arranged a meeting between Siegfried and Gabriel on November 20th. Siegfried started an affair with Gabriel, but he called things off because Gabriel liked to sleep around. He even had an affair with Siegfried's friend, Osbert Sitwell. A little side note, Gabriel would also go on to have an affair with John Maynard Keynes. Remember, John was in the Bloomsbury group that Virginia Woolf was also a part in. Siegfried's next documented lover was Ivor Novello. Ivor was an actor. This affair was a short-lived one. Ivor was also a hoe. And that is not me slut-shaming anyone. That's just me speaking the truth. Siegfried's biographer, John Stewart Roberts, said Ivor, quote, was a consummate flirt who collected lovers as he gathered lilacs, end quote. I usually don't mention this until the end of an episode, but there is a movie called Benediction about Siegfried's life, and if the portrayal of Ivor was accurate, then he was a real douche. He treated Siegfried like absolute shit, and he literally had me screaming at my television for Siegfried to love himself more and kick Ivor to the curb. Siegfried's next lover was another actor, and one of Ivor's exes. Drama. It was Glenn Byam Shaw. Siegfried and Glenn never became anything serious, and the affair ended quickly, but the two remained friends for the rest of Siegfried's life. Though the romance was short-lived, it did inspire at least one poem out of Siegfried. The poem goes, quote, "Though you have left me, I'm not yet alone, for what we were befriends the firelit room, and what you said remains and is my own. To make a living gladness of my gloom, the firelight leaps and shows your empty chair, and all our harmonies of speech are stilled. But you are with me in the voiceless air. My hands are empty, but my heart is filled." End quote. Siegfried's next lover was a prince, like an actual, literal prince. He was a German prince and a great-grandson of Queen Victoria. He was Prince Philip of Hesse. The two had met in Rome in 1922. That relationship also didn't last long for a number of reasons. One, distance, and also Philip became a Nazi supporter, and that put a little damper on things. But also because, yet again, poor Siegfried had found himself a man that liked to be promiscuous. Siegfried wrote this in his diary, quote, "Am I only one of P's regular succession of affairs?" End quote. The writer Beverly Nichols, and that was a man, by the way, was the next love interest in Siegfried's life. This was another romance that fizzled out quickly. Then there was Stephen Tennant. He was an aristocrat. The pair met on June 22nd, 1927 at a christening dinner held by Cerebral Sitwell. Siegfried had first noticed Stephen 13 days prior at a dinner hosted by Osbert Sitwell. Siegfried was taken with him right away. Stephen invited Siegfried to come stay at Wilfrid's Manor that September. There were others staying at the manor, including the Sitwells. During a game of hide-and-seek, Stephen begged Siegfried to take him for a drive. Stephen then showed up at Siegfried's room at 3 a.m. wearing motoring clothes and bright pink lipstick. They traveled to Stonehenge and they stayed out until dawn. Siegfried wrote in his diary that Stephen was, quote, "making the most passionate of vows and simply intoxicating my senses," end quote. They went to London together the next day, and Stephen talked about Siegfried's poetry and told him that he had never been so happy. Stephen later confessed that his new friendship with Siegfried left him, quote, "almost swooning with happiness," end quote. That friendship turned into something more. Stephen wrote this about Siegfried in his diary, quote, "He put his mouth over mine, crushing it. Some kisses seemed to draw a very soul out of his body, his to mine. I feel all my heart swooning at the touch of his mouth. My soul dies 100,000,000 deaths when his face is on my face and neck," end quote. For almost the next 6 years, they built a life together. They traveled all around Europe. They collaborated on 3 pamphlets for Faber's aerial poems. Siegfried wrote the poems and Stephen drew the illustrations. Stephen wrote this in his diary about Siegfried, quote, "I never tire of his face, his wonderful hands, and beautiful expressive body. Sometimes his face is lined and ravaged, and his eyes are bright and hollowly oriental. His frowning and brooding face is lovely too, but best I love his clear, still look, which comes when we are in the woods, by our river, in pine-scented mossy glades, or on hillsides in June sun and winds. Then he is the most wonderful," end quote. But sometimes fairy tales don't have happy endings. Stephen had reoccurring tuberculosis, and that put a strain on his relationship with Siegfried. In May of 1933, Stephen was receiving treatment at a sanatorium in Kent. That was where Stephen decided it was time to end things with Siegfried. Siegfried got a letter from Stephen's physician telling him that Stephen never wanted to see him again. Siegfried was completely crushed. A few months later, Siegfried met a woman named Hester Gaddy. The pain that Stephen had caused him still ran deep. There was something about Hester that made Siegfried believe that he could confide in her. He told Hester about his relationship with Stephen. This was a risk because homosexuality was still illegal. Hester told him that he needed to write Stephen so his past could be his past. Stephen took her advice. Siegfried and Stephen ended up exchanging letters and phone calls, and there were even a few visits here and there for years to come, but Siegfried and Stephen were never a couple again. Siegfried's next lover was a shock to all of the people around him, and that was because his next lover was Hester. This was the first time Siegfried had been with a woman, but Siegfried did love her. He met Hester on September 5th, 1933, and by December 18th of that same year, they were married. He sent love letters to Hester. This comes from a letter he sent her dated October 9th, 1933. Quote, "No one in the world matters to me now, no one except Hester. I have first calculated that to go through all the poetry I want to share with you, it will take exactly 999 years, and there will be more time needed for music." End quote. This comes from a letter dated October 16th, 1933. Quote, "I believe that my whole life has been a preparation for the moment when I met you, and know in my soul that we were made for one another. You, the first woman I have ever loved. There will be no memories, Hester, when you are mine, only the memories of years of frustration which you will make me forget." End quote. And in another letter he wrote her on October 25th, 1933, he writes, quote, "You are my life, my soul's redemption, and the end of all my vigils." End quote. He would write Hester all the time. Sometimes he would write her multiple times a day. On May 21st, 1936, he wrote her 3 times in one day. Those 3 letters took up 5.5 pages. It is very clear that from his letters and his diary that he did, in fact, love Hester. Together, Siegfried and Hester had a son named George Thornycroft Sassoon, born on October 30th, 1936. A child was something that Siegfried had longed for a long time. Siegfried loved his son. He even wrote poems dedicated to George. One poem is his poem titled "To My Son." It goes, quote, "Go and be gay. You are born into the dazzling light of day. Go and be wise. You are born upon an earth which meets new eyes. Go and be strong. You are born into a world where love rights wrong. Go and be brave. Possesses your soul that you alone can save." End quote. The love found in those letters, though, would break down after World War II. They had some problems in their marriage. One of the problems was Siegfried wanted more children, and Hester did not. The couple decided to divorce in 1945. Hester moved to Scotland, and she took George with her. Siegfried was still able to see George, but he was unable to have the close relationship with George like he had hoped. I'm not sure why Hester moved to Scotland or why Siegfried could not follow. Siegfried at this time was living at Heytesbury House in Wiltshire. Siegfried had inherited that house from his paternal aunt, Rachel Beer. But Siegfried's love life wasn't the only important or interesting thing about Siegfried. If this is your first episode of History Shelf, I do have a theme for each season, and I pick people that fall into that theme. But I tell you more about their life than just how they relate to the theme of the season. And I do that because, well, people aren't just one thing. There's not just one thing that defines us or our life. So I like to tell you the whole story, or at least as much of the story as I can. After World War I, Siegfried did not abandon his anti-war stance. In fact, in November of 1918, Siegfried supported a Labour Party politician named Philip Snowden. Philip had been a pacifist. Siegfried gave speeches in favor of Philip. Siegfried became a literary editor of the Daily Herald in 1919. That was a socialist publication. One of his duties was to employ reviewers. One of the people that he employed was another person that made a guest appearance in the Virginia Woolf episodes of this podcast, and that was E.M. Forster. This made me wonder if Siegfried and Virginia ever met, since it appears that they ran in the same circles. And they did meet. She met him with her lover, Vita Sackville-West, in the mid-1920s, and he also met with Virginia and her husband, Leonard Woolf. Siegfried was a fan of Leonard's work, and Virginia made a good impression on him. He wrote in his diary that he found her, quote, charming. Siegfried sort of fanboyed a little when he met them, and he was worried about making a good impression. He must have made a good impression because Virginia and Leonard told him that he should publish a book with their publishing imprint, and he did end up publishing with Hogarth Press. Siegfried didn't just stay in Europe. He made his way across the United States for a lecture tour. During this time, his publisher gave him a car, and his friends made fun of him for his lack of driving skills. While Siegfried was in the United States, a passion for a new form of writing sparked. Up until 1928, the only form of writing he did was poetry. But in 1928, he put his pen to paper to write prose. The book was Memories of a Fox Hunting Man. It was a fictionalized autobiography. The book was published anonymously, and it became an instant classic. This book had a humorous side to it. That was a side of Siegfried that he had not shown the world yet. The book won the James Tate Black Award for fiction. Siegfried wasn't just a one-hit wonder either. He continued to write successful prose. He wrote 3 volumes of an autobiography. These volumes were The Old Country, The Weald of Youth, and Siegfried's Journey. They were all acclaimed. Throughout his life, Siegfried wrote many collections of poetry and many prose. Faith and spirituality was something that Siegfried struggled with for most of his life. Then, in 1957, he converted to Catholicism. Siegfried's ex-wife, Hester, had a brother that had a daughter named Jessica. Siegfried was made her godfather when she was born in 1938, but of course, Siegfried and Hester broke up when Jessica was still a child, so Siegfried and Jessica really didn't have a relationship while she was growing up. But in 1958, they had a chance encounter. Jessica was 21 and she was staying with her parents in Yorkshire. Siegfried went to Yorkshire for a weekend. Jessica had been an atheist for most of her life, but in 1958 she found herself searching, wondering. Siegfried had a profound effect on her. Soon, Jessica started visiting Siegfried regularly. She found herself drawn to Catholicism. They were hanging out in the garden one day. Siegfried showed Jessica a petal and said, quote, "You have to believe that someone created that," end quote. Jessica said, quote, I recognized at that moment that yes, someone had. Siegfried was right. End quote. Jessica became Catholic. This did not go over well with Jessica's family. They were already not the biggest fans of Siegfried's because of how things went down with him and Hester. Jessica's parents blamed Siegfried for Jessica becoming Catholic. Jessica became a nun, but that was something, sadly, that Siegfried never got to see. Siegfried died from stomach cancer on September 1st, 1967. He was 80 years old. He was buried at St. Andrew's Church, Mells, Somerset. Siegfried was appointed commander of the Order of the British Empire in the 1951 New Year honors. His Commander British Empire Military Cross and campaign medals can be seen on display at the Royal Welch Fusiliers Museum at Carnarvon Castle. That was where King Edward II was born, so there's Siegfried's connection to the first person that I covered on this podcast this season. On November 11th, 1985, Siegfried was among 16 Great War poets commemorated on a slate stone at Westminster Abbey's Poets' Corner. The inscription on the stone was written by Wilfrid. It reads, quote, "My subject is war, and the pity of war, the poetry is in the pity," end quote. In the anthology series British television plays, the Wednesday play, there was an installment titled Mad Jack, and it was based off of Siegfried's time during World War I. Pat Barker wrote a novel called Regeneration. It is a fictionalized telling of Siegfried's life that was also turned into a film. BBC did a dramatized documentary about Siegfried in his later years. It was called The Pity of War, and I already mentioned the movie Benediction. There is a movie called The Burying Party, but that is focused on Wilfrid. But Siegfried is portrayed in it. He is also portrayed in the movie about Robert Graves titled The Laureate, and in an episode of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. The episode is titled Some Early August 1916. And that was the life of Siegfried Sassoon. Thank you so much for listening to the 23rd episode of the 4th season of History Shelf. I'm going to be covering 15 people this season. Next week's episode is going to be about Greta Garbo. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Instagram is at history_shelf_pod. The Twitter/X is at History Shelf Podcast. And the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will give a shout out to you on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of the episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month. And with that, you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first 2 tiers, plus you will get a handwritten note of thanks mailed to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want except for the Zipper Putty. You can also take out ad space on this podcast. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. Or you can click on one of the affiliated links. There's one for Riverside, one for Amazon, and one for Bookshop. If you click on one of those links and you buy something, that helps support the podcast. But if you don't want any of the merch, and you don't want any of the perks, and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help support the podcast, I turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes. But as always, the best way that you can support this podcast is to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways that you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast with your friends and family on social media would be very helpful. All right, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode.